That particular interview coming up with the committee chair at around 6:30 this morning, around 6:35. But we're going to continue to get reaction on this controversial Electoral Amendment Bill, which has been passed. It was 98 MPs who were against the bill. They were outvoted by 232 votes who were in favour. So what does it all actually mean, bearing in mind we're heading and hurtling very quickly to the elections in 2024. Let's speak to Hermann Pretorius from the Institute of Race Relations. Hermann, good to have you with us on ENCA. Appreciate the time. So summarise this for me. As this was passed, what was your impression?
Well, I must say my first impression is that it is truly unfortunate that such an important piece of legislation was rushed in the last real opportunity for the law to be brought into line with the Constitutional Court judgment of June 2020. This bill might, in the mere formality of the text, offer a route for independents to represent people in Parliament. But unfortunately, it doesn't really add to the spirit or the value-based assessment of making it possible for independent candidates to compete against the institutionalized political parties in our country. And I think that's to the detriment of democracy in South Africa.
Explain to me how. How does this affect those who are going to be voting in the elections come 2024? How far away from a democratic ideal would this be?
Well, firstly, I think one has to face the difficult issue of the constitutional obligation for the so-called in general proportional rule, where the Constitution requires the South African electoral system to have this in general proportional outcome. Now, that's actually quite an odd and perhaps a difficult concept to explain in law, and the Constitution itself doesn't give us too much information on that. But the best analysis I've read and the best people I've spoken to agree that that in general proportional rule means that any distortion in seat allocation based on voting results must actually, if there is any distortion, happen across the board, affecting candidates and parties roughly equally. The problem with the bill as currently stating the process for seat allocation, you get a situation where independent candidates have to perform orders of magnitude better than political parties to gain a single seat. Now, that is a fundamental constitutional shortcoming of this piece of legislation. But then you also get to the idea of the redistribution of votes to prevent the so-called wasted vote problem. For if a very popular independent were to stand for a seat and get 1 million seats, but only 90,000 votes are needed for that independent to actually gain a seat in Parliament, what happens to the remaining votes of that 1 million? So those are problems that affect the voters' ability to have a say in who governs. And I must say it's frustrating that a much better system, while a bit more complicated and a bit more timeless in terms of its implication, exists already in South Africa at the local government level, where we have the ability of independents to stand as ward candidates and also have the proportional element brought in as constitutionally mandated through the PR element. 2 ballots for a fair system.
Yeah, I was about to say that does work out to be a fair system as well. The issue is going to be that you do find independent candidates, don't you, Herman, who are quite influential in their constituents as well. Now, the problem is, unless there's very good election education ahead of 2024, people are going to go out and vote for these independent candidates only to then realize, actually, they don't really have any teeth once you work out all the numbers. It sounds to me like they're being set up to fail, or is that unfair?
I don't think that's unfair. And I must say the voter in this situation, we must understand that in South Africa, with massive poverty, massive unemployment, youth unemployment, the people who are going to participate in the next election, I have to be honest, I mean, for a political nerd like me, I'm happy to spend a few hours figuring out the ins and outs of an electoral system. Most South Africans quite rightly have better things to worry about. And this idea that in almost 500 days, we will be voting on for the next government of this country on a completely new system. And as you rightly point out, Gareth, that might not have the time to be properly explained to voters. I must say, I think it is disingenuous, and it verges on disenfranchising. And what makes it so much worse is this complete, dog's breakfast of a bill was avoidable. It had Parliament acted soon enough on the Constitutional Court judgment in June 2020.
And I suppose there's also a cost to this as well. It costs to run elections, and it costs to run any elections as well. Many of these independent candidates, Herman, don't always necessarily have the money to run in the elections as well. And that's going to be even worse, knowing their chances of having any power, if they were to get any kind of seats, is actually meaningless. So what we're doing, essentially, is taking independent candidacy effectively out of the run. They're on the ballot sheet, but it doesn't mean very much in real terms, does it?
No, and that is quite problematic when you come to the new nation judgment of the Constitutional Court, where we have to admit that Section 38 of the Bill of Rights obligates all people, all government structures and entities in the country to, when interpreting the Bill of Rights, applying the Bill of Rights, to not just seek the strict legalistic textual satisfaction of justice, but also the values and quite often called the spirit of the law. Now, this bill might satisfy the technical definition of giving independents a route to Parliament, but it doesn't do so in terms of a value judgment or the spirit of the law. And currently, on some rough calculations, it is quite clear that a parliamentary seat allocated to a party can be gained on around 40,000 votes. An independent will be lucky on this bill to get a seat on 90 to 100,000 votes. I think that is terribly unfair. So it satisfies perhaps the formal, sterile text of giving independents that route, but it surely doesn't enhance our democracy. And this is a failing that Parliament and the Minister for Home Affairs need to address. And it makes it a very, very difficult question, because we only have about 550 days before the next election. So we have a few options. Either we can ask the Constitutional Court for a further suspension of their finding of unconstitutionality until after the election, so that the next election can at least take place on a system voters are familiar with, the current existing system, with an eye to fix these problems towards 2029. Or we can have an interim system that would be, I think, the worst of all worlds. Or we could try to ram through a new adequate system. The problem with that, of course, is the IEC needs to implement that system, needs to train its staff on that system. And of course, if there's going to be a constituency component, there needs to be a constituency demarcation process. All of these things take time, and time is unfortunately something we don't really have.
No, we don't really have, especially when you start breaking it down like you have, Herman, just over 550 days until the next elections. I know it's always, it seems like it's far off into the distance when we say in a couple of years' time, but when you count it like that, it's a very, very good point. Hermann Pretorius, thank you. Always a pleasure to speak to you. From the Institute of Race Relations, we are going to continue unpacking this new Electoral Amendment Bill. We're going to be hearing from Mosa Chabane, Home Affairs Portfolio Committee Chair, get their thoughts at around 6:35.